Right, so Keir Starmer might well be tearing his brill-creamed hair out today as Hamas are taking the UK government to court, taking him to court over the terror designation they have got, having engaged legal representation here in the UK and submitted a 106-page dossier by way of a defence, as well as exercising their rights under Section 4 of the Terrorism Act, not to mention the European Convention on Human Rights as well, to set out their stall as to why they should no longer be a proscribed group in the UK. Since they currently are completely proscribed, however, it would behove me to state at this point that no part of this video is in any way, shape or form expressing support for Hamas, because that would be illegal. But will that remain the case going forwards? Hamas's military wing was proscribed all the way back in 2001. It was a somewhat out of the blue move in 2021 by then Home Secretary Priti Patel to include the political side of Hamas in that designation as well. The official government of Gaza, as they were at the time and remain so to this day, such as Gaza is now after 18 months of Israel's genocide. They, of course, not proscribed at all. So do Hamas have a case here? Is the UK's one-sided positioning here on Israel's side very much against Hamas, therefore being on the side of Israel against Gaza, making them complicit in genocide as Hamas argue, when Hamas are all that functionally stands between Israel and their total seizure of Gaza? And how damaging will it be for the UK if they end up being forced to lift, even in part, the terror designation on Hamas? Right, so it was, cast your mind back folks, all the way back to November 2021, it wasn't that long ago really, that the UK government under then Home Secretary Priti Patel decided to expand its proscription of Hamas to include not only its military wing, the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, but also its political wing. And this decision was framed as, well, Hamas are all the same. It doesn't matter what part of Hamas they are, they're all the same. They're all terrorists, framed as some kind of moral stand against terrorism as it was. But it's since faced a considerable amount of scrutiny, and not least because of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where Israel has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians, seemingly with full Western backing. Now Hamas has launched a legal challenge against the UK government over this, seeking to overturn this designation as a terrorist organisation in its entirety. But even in part, it would be something of an achievement. The case is being brought forward by lawyers Fahad Ansari of Riverway Law, Daniel Grutters of One Pump Court Chambers and Frank McGuinness of Garden Court Chambers, who are arguing that the UK's blanket ban on Hamas from one end to the other stifles diplomatic avenues, contradicts historical precedents such as, for example, the negotiations with Sinn Féin during the Northern Ireland peace process, and may even constitute complicity in Israel's genocide by denying Hamas, who are the governing authority in Gaza, any legitimacy at all, and locking the UK government out of entering negotiations with them that could lead to the peace process finally reaching a resolution, potentially, in theory. So the UK first proscribed Hamas's military wing in 2001, but they maintained a distinction between that armed faction and the political leadership. This changed in 2021 though, when Patel, who was then and is now a staunch supporter of Israel, who can forget her trying to use international aid to fund Israeli activity in the Golan Heights, for example, forced to resign over that little stunt, wasn't she, extended the ban to the entire organisation now, both military and political. So what was her justification? That there was no distinction and that Hamas's attacks on Israel were because the group is entirely rabidly anti-Semitic. Well, that doesn't make them a terror threat, though. That would, even if it were true, make them racist. But of course, the real racism is claiming attacks on Israel are ever anti-Semitic. It is a self-proclaimed Jewish state, but its actions endanger more Jewish people around the world than they claim to stand up for. And certainly a great many Jewish people decry and denounce Israel's actions and even its very existence, a Western colonial project as it inherently is. Patel's move, therefore, to proscribe Hamas's political wing, the militant side certainly having carried out acts of terror, and they don't even deny that either, is based on bias, therefore, was arguably an ideological move rather than anything based on UK national security, since when have Hamas ever been a direct threat to the UK? Now, this move was controversial because it was downright hypocritical and exposes real problems with UK proscription. Unlike the case of the IRA and Sinn Féin, where the UK negotiated with the political wing despite the IRA's armed campaign and attacks that very much had impacted the UK, Hamas has been entirely blacklisted, and this undermines UK claims to be an impartial entity in conflict resolution when they only are when it suits them, it seems. If dialogue with Sinn Féin was essential for peace in Northern Ireland, why is it unacceptable with the political wing of Hamas, particularly when Gaza faces annihilation and they are the Gazan government, such as that stands at this moment? By fully prescribing Hamas, the UK effectively endorses Israel's narrative that no Palestinian resistance, armed or political, can therefore be legitimate. So is that a fair assessment or not? Therefore, the legal challenge itself by Hamas's legal team, who have not been paid anything for their services, entirely pro bono as it is, because, again, it would be illegal to accept funds from a designated terror group, are challenging the proscription on several grounds, utilising both the Terrorism Act of 2000 against the government for once, instead of the government overreaching and using it far too often against ordinary people up and down this country who are coming out in support of Gaza and against the attacks by Israel there, and also the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR. Now, that Terrorism Act of 2000 is coming for a lot of scrutiny in recent months, and a lot of condemnation as well, being vague in its terminology and being used as a blunt tool to stifle protest. A single complaint against an individual is all that is required to elicit a visit from the fuzz. So there is ample room for credible lawyers to use the Act's shortcomings to expose heavy-handedness, and this forms part of the case. But equally, there is provision within the Terrorism Act to challenge it. Section 4 of the Terrorism Act gives a proscribed body the right to appeal that proscription, an application of de-proscription, if you will. But also included in the 106-page appeal by Hamas are arguments concerning a whole host of issues which seem ridiculous that they even exist, and all the more so when you consider the Terrorist Act has remained unamended since 2006. For example, the fact that the Home Secretary has unilateral power to proscribe groups without judicial oversight is, as appears to be the case with Patel being so avowedly pro-Israel, a serious shortcoming. Hamas's lawyers argue that this process lacks transparency and due process, therefore. The failure to distinguish between political and military wings of a given body is a farce as well, considering the UK's own track record, its own history with, again, the IRA, which showed that engagement with political factions can and does lead to peace. By refusing to recognise any part of Hamas, therefore, hypocritical as that appears to be, the UK shuts down potential negotiations it could be part of if it chose to be. And one of the most serious allegations which face the UK's government is of complicity in genocide here. Because with Israel's destruction of Gaza ongoing, aided and abetted by UK surveillance flights, as are now well known about, increasingly more well known about, the UK's refusal to engage with Hamas as well, who are the elected governing authority, effectively sidelines Palestinian voices whilst Israel continues ethnic cleansing and genocide. And then on top of that, you have ECHR violations too. The legal team argues that the ban infringes on rights to freedom of association contained in Article 11 of the ECHR and political expression, Article 10 of the ECHR. If Hamas is entirely barred from political recognition, Palestinians in the UK who engage with them, even for humanitarian reasons, even just to oppose the genocide in Gaza, risk prosecution by doing so. And then, of course, there is the double standards and hypocrisy here. Despite overwhelming evidence of war crimes and apartheid, illegal occupation, and now genocide, Israel has never been designated a terrorist state by the UK. Its military actions in Gaza, targeting hospitals, schools, refugee camps, most newsworthy of late an ambulance crew, far exceed Hamas's capabilities. Yet only one side ever faces sanctions, and of course we've witnessed 18 months of this. Yet the excuses the UK government give for turning a blind eye to it all come back to that one night of October 7th, that all-encompassing one night of October 7th, which, yes, was an act of terror worthy of condemnation. But what about everything that has happened since? It cannot be justified. 18 months of genocide cannot be justifiable as a legitimate response, surely. So why will the UK government not call it out? Why will they not call a genocide a genocide? Why will they not hold Israel to the same standard as a terrorist entity as Hamas, if they are still committing terrorism, and on a much greater scale? And then, of course, I could point to the example of Syria most recently and the de-proscription of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the now de facto unelected government of Syria, whose leader and now unelected president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, once had a $10 million bounty on his head for acts of terror. Al-Qaeda cast-offs, as that lot are. Al-Qaeda, literally the government of Syria these days, de-proscripted, because they've now got legitimacy, apparently. Well, the UK's decision came just as arbitrarily there as proscription does. despite al-Qaeda having legitimately committed acts of terror on our soil as well, which Hamas have never done. This lot get forgiven, name change and conquering a country and deposing a regime the UK didn't like, all that was required for Syria, all that was required for HTS to gain that legitimacy. This decision was made without any clear justification. It was done rather quietly too, that they disappeared off the prescription list, and undermines the credibility of UK prescriptions. If HTS, a group with well-documented atrocities, not least in connection with the terror group they were born out of, can be delisted, then the whole system is a farce. And what are the consequences? Solidarity with the Gazan people can be undermined if UK citizens can be seen for expressing support for Hamas in any way. Face prosecution for that. And that's why I take great care to always make clear I am not doing that here. I am not offering Hamas support. They have committed acts of terrorism, and it is illegal to do so for another. From a diplomatic perspective, though, it blocks peace efforts by refusing to engage with Hamas, by making it illegal to do so. The UK ensures that no viable Gazan leadership can be negotiated with, leaving Gaza's fate entirely in Israel's hands, and we're party to that in more ways than just this, of course. Functionally, it sends a message out that legitimises Israeli violence, that then reinforces the narrative that Palestinians have no right to resist occupation, no matter how brutal that occupation has been, and continues to become. So ultimately, is Hamas's legal challenge just about a terror listing? This is bigger than that, isn't it? It's about whether the UK will adhere to its own principles or continue enabling genocide on one hand, and on another it is asking if the UK truly believes in conflict resolution. Because if it does, it has to reconsider its blanket ban on Hamas, just as it once engaged with Sinn Féin, because that case and others just expose the double standards and hypocrisy of this situation. The case also exposes the arbitrary nature of terror designations in the UK, that they come and go seemingly on a whim, revealing them as tools of political convenience rather than justice, and arguably are decisions that should be taken out of the hands of politicians entirely and put in the hands of the judiciary. If Israel can bomb children with impunity while Hamas is barred from politics, then the UK's counter-terrorism policy is not about safety, it's about picking sides. Apparently, no matter how awful the atrocity committed by the side they back. So this case will make for interesting observation, because we'll all soon see whether Britain's courts address some serious shortcomings in UK terror legislation, which desperately needs addressing given the arbitrary and heavy-handed usage of it, abuse of it, under the Starmer regime, and uphold the law or submit to political pressure. Either way, the outcome will shape not just Hamas's standing, but the UK's moral credibility in an era of unprecedented violence against the people of Palestine, when the UK's government's support for those committing terror against Palestinians seemed utterly unshakable no matter what they do. It especially doesn't help that a body within the Labour Party like Labour Friends of Israel has such a pervasive grip on so many Labour MPs, and not least Keir Starmer himself. But they dared to criticise Israel just very, very slightly the other day for deporting 2 Labour MPs they refused to let into the country, who were considered too critical of Israel, because there are even more rabidly pro-Zionist groups than even LFI, and one of them has now deigned apparently to report LFI to the Israeli authorities, seeking to get them all banned from going to Israel. Oh, what a lovely dose of karma that would be. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe before you do so, though, if you haven't already done so, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new content published daily, as well as supporting the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.